I've always been a night owl, so working late shifts at the supermarket seemed like the perfect fit. It's quiet, predictable, at least that's what I thought. But lately, things haven't felt right. Started off small. I'd be stocking shelves or organizing products, and I'd notice something was off. Items would move just a little, like I'd put a can of soup on the top shelf, turn to grab another, and when I looked back, the can would be on the shelf below. I chalked it up to fatigue. It's easy to get a little loopy working alone at night, right? But then the flickering started. The lights would blink on and off just briefly, but only in the aisle I was working in. The rest of the store remained perfectly lit. Every time it happened, I'd glance up at the humming fluorescence, half expecting to see a burned-out bulb or faulty wiring. But everything looked normal. No one else mentioned the lights. And every time I'd ask the manager if we'd had electrical problems, she'd just give me a puzzled look, telling me everything was working fine. But the worst part wasn't the lights or the shifting items. It was the silence. A kind of thick, heavy quiet that would fall over certain aisles. You wouldn't think a place as empty as a supermarket at night would feel watched. But that's exactly how it felt. Every time I walked down aisle 6, the canned goods aisle, it was as though something unseen was lurking just out of sight, staring at me from the shadows. The silence in that aisle was different, like even the hum of the fridges in the next row couldn't break through it. I started taking the long way around, avoiding aisle 6 whenever I could. But each night, no matter what I did, I found myself drawn back there, like some invisible force was pulling me in. And every time I could swear I wasn't alone. It didn't take long for things to get worse. Shadows started appearing, slipping in and out of the aisles just at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was just some of the other night shift workers, maybe Luis or Jamie, cutting through aisles or taking shortcuts. I'd catch these glimpses of movement and call out, expecting to hear someone's voice or see them come around the corner. But every time, the aisles were empty. One night, I was stocking the freezers in the back corner of the store when I saw it. A dark figure, almost human-shaped, moving along the shelves at the far end of the aisle. My heart skipped a beat, and I called out, "Luis? Jamie? Is that you?" Silence. The shadow froze, then slipped out of sight as quickly as it had appeared. I hurried down the aisle, hoping to catch a trace of whoever it was, but there was nothing. Just rows of canned goods and my own confused reflection in the freezer glass. It was then that it hit me. I hadn't heard the door chime that let us know someone had come in or left. I was supposed to be alone. The following night, the whispering began. I was in the middle of restocking when I heard it. A faint murmur, just barely audible, drifting through the store. It sounded like voices, like people muttering just out of earshot. I stopped, held my breath, and listened. The words weren't clear, just a soft, eerie susurrus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing off the cold tiles. The whispering stopped, and for a second, I thought I'd imagined it. But just as I went back to work, it started again, this time a bit louder, closer. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unsettling, like voices filled with anger or desperation. Every night after that, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They followed me through the store, fading in and out like whoever or whatever was making them was moving just out of reach. The whispers seemed to come from the shadows themselves, twisting around shelves, crawling along the walls, sinking into the silence that seemed to grow thicker each night. By the end of the week, I stopped bothering to call out. No one was there, or at least no one I wanted to meet. Just when I thought things couldn't get any stranger, the customers started showing up. It was odd because, by midnight, we hardly ever got anyone coming in. But these people weren't your usual late-night shoppers. They were different. The first time I saw one of them, I was restocking cereal. A woman came down the aisle, wearing a faded dress that looked like it belonged in the 70s. Pale yellow, with a lace collar and sleeves that puffed out around her elbows. Her hair was styled in loose curls, her skin almost chalky under the harsh fluorescent lights. She didn't look at me, didn't make a sound, just walked slowly, staring straight ahead. Her face was blank, emotionless, as if her mind was somewhere far away. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. She just kept walking, her shoes tapping against the linoleum in a steady, almost rhythmic beat. I felt a chill as she passed, an eerie, uncomfortable stillness hanging in the air, like even the shelves were holding their breath. I glanced back, expecting to see her heading toward the checkout, but when I looked, she was gone. Just like that. I checked every aisle, even looked outside, but there was no trace of her. I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself that maybe she had just slipped out quietly. But then the others started appearing. It became a regular thing. Every other night, I'd see one or two of them. A man in a dark suit with a narrow tie, his eyes dull and sunken. A child with an old-fashioned dress, her expression far too serious, staring blankly as she clutched a teddy bear. Each of them dressed in clothing that seemed decades old, with the same vacant, hollow look in their eyes. They walked with slow, stiff movements, as if they weren't really there, as if they were moving through some other reality I wasn't supposed to see. One night, after I saw a man in a ragged coat walk into the store and disappear down an aisle without a trace, I decided to check the security footage. I figured maybe I was just too exhausted and seeing things that weren't really there. But when I reviewed the footage, my stomach dropped. There was nothing. No woman in a yellow dress, no man in the narrow tie, no child with the teddy bear. Just me walking through the aisles alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in that store. The shadows, the whispers, those strange customers who left no trace. It was starting to wear me down. I felt like I was being pulled deeper into some kind of nightmare. And then, one night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. I was restocking near the employee lounge when I overheard two of my coworkers whispering. They were talking about a storage room in the back, one that no one was supposed to enter. I'd never seen it, but apparently, it was kept locked, hidden behind shelves near the loading dock. They mentioned it in passing, just enough to make me wonder. Why would we have a storage room that no one could use? What was being kept in there? That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My shift dragged on, each hour making the itch of curiosity worse. By the end, I had made up my mind. I had to know what was inside. Around 3 a.m., when the store was at its quietest, I made my way to the back. The storage room was exactly where they'd said it would be, tucked behind some forgotten crates and sealed with an old, rusty lock. My heart was pounding as I forced the lock open with a crowbar I'd found nearby. It snapped with a loud clang that seemed to echo in the emptiness. The door creaked open, and I was immediately hit with the smell. Stale, damp, and oddly metallic. I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside. The room was cramped, filled with old, dusty shelves that held strange objects. Things that had no business being in a supermarket. There were boxes of old uniforms, broken mannequins, and, on a table in the far corner, a collection of personal belongings. But it was the photographs that stopped me cold. There were dozens of them, pinned to a corkboard on the wall. Black and white snapshots of people, most of them wearing supermarket uniforms like mine. I squinted, leaning closer, and felt a wave of nausea as I recognized some of their faces. They were former employees, people who had worked the night shift before me. I'd heard whispers about some of them, stories about how they'd left suddenly or just disappeared. I traced my fingers over one of the photos. A young guy, smiling in his uniform. He looked like he was barely out of high school. Beneath each photo was a date, written in faded ink. Some of the dates went back decades, others were more recent. But all of them had one thing in common. They marked the last day that person had been seen. I felt something shift in the room, like the air was thickening around me. It was then that I noticed the mirror on the far wall, its surface dusty and smudged. As I stared into it, I saw something move behind me, a shadow gliding across the room. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just rows of empty shelves and the haunting faces on the wall. My skin crawled as I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. I didn't look back as I locked it and stashed the crowbar where I'd found it. But as I walked away, one thought kept racing through my mind. the others had found this room too, and none of them had made it out. I couldn't just leave it alone. Finding that storage room had only made things worse. It was as if the walls were closing in on me, like the store itself knew I was getting too close to the truth. The faces in those photographs haunted me, especially knowing that some of them had once been in my exact position, working the night shift, trapped in this eerie cycle. I felt like I was caught in a web, one that had been spun long before I ever started working here. I started digging. During my breaks, I'd search through old employee records, trying to find any information on the people in those photos. But all their files had been wiped clean. No notes, no termination records, nothing. It was like they'd simply vanished. Then I turned to old newspaper archives, and that's when I began to piece things together. Years ago, long before the store was built, the land it stood on had a dark history. According to the articles, it had once been the site of an old lodge, a place used for strange gatherings by a group that the locals had only referred to as the Keepers. Rumor had it they were obsessed with rituals, some kind of ancient practices meant to bind spirits to places, and over time, several unexplained disappearances had been connected to that lodge. It had been torn down, but people kept whispering that whatever they'd summoned hadn't left. When the supermarket opened years later, those rumors only grew. Every so often, someone on the night shift would vanish without a trace, and each time, no one asked too many questions. It was as if the management knew but didn't care. Or maybe they knew and didn't dare to interfere. The more I read, the clearer it became. The supermarket was part of some ongoing ritual. The night shift workers were offerings, replacements for whatever the Keepers had bound here years ago. Each of us, myself included, was being marked. It was as if stepping foot in that storage room had set something in motion, like I'd unwittingly accepted my fate the moment I touched those photos. My last night at the store, I felt it, an oppressive weight in the air, pressing down on me. Shadows moved freely between the aisles, and I heard whispers, louder than ever, voices hissing my name, begging me to join them. I kept my head down, forcing myself to finish the shift, every instinct screaming at me to run. As soon as my shift ended, I grabbed my things and left without looking back. I told myself I'd never return, but even as I walked out the doors, I could feel it. That pull, like something was watching, waiting for me to come back. Since that night, I felt strange. I catch glimpses of shadows where they shouldn't be, hear faint whispers late at night, and sometimes, I swear I see faces in the windows, staring, always with that same blank, hollow look. It's as if I never truly escaped, like a part of me is still trapped inside those walls, just waiting for the day it pulls me back in.